Okay.
So, cool. I think we're good. So I'm curious, how did you first get exposed to this book, and what was your sort of way into it?
Yeah, so it was Gilead was a book that when I was in college was like a buzzword. Everyone was reading it. Everyone was loving it. I think at so I went to Wheaton for undergrad, and I think on top of C.S. Lewis, Marilyn Robinson was like almost sainted name. And so I knew I needed to read it, and I didn't have the opportunity until my senior year in college. And it was kind of this optional assignment to go and read a book and then present it to my senior seminar class, I think it was.
Hmm.
And I read it, and it lived up to everyone's praise of it. I don't know. I think it just the voice of John Ames and
The voice of what? I'm sorry.
of John Ames,
Oh
the
yeah, yeah.
um, and just the beautiful meditative quality of the book. Everything that Marilyn Robinson was doing to illustrate what it means to live and think um, contemplatively, and to live in a small community, uh,
Hmm.
and all his wrestlings with doubt and faith, and just like this beautiful letter he's writing to his
Hold on
wife,
just 1 second. Hey
and
guys, could you be a little bit quieter, please? Thanks. Okay. I told you there'd be some noise.
right, you're good.
Gets ready. Get you ready for what's to come.
Oh yeah, no, this is great.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then since then I taught Gilead, which was really hard to do. I kind of realizing it's hard to. I think it's a book that demands to be read so slowly, almost sometimes even devotionally.
Yeah.
It, um, so it presents its own challenges. But I've been to conferences where people have presented on Gilead. I've
Didn't
apparently
Wheaton do a Robinson conference? Didn't they do something about the author?
yeah. So she was there. I went to that one. Williams, all sorts of big name people were there, and it was a really amazing conference. But yeah, this book definitely has a special place in my heart, and in the writing, kind of considered Gilead is considered like the ultimate novel that the Christian writer wants to write.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, what that is to me.
So, yeah, I loved it, and it resonated deeply with me just as a pastor
Mm,
too. So, it's about a pastor, and a lot of what they described, I thought was so accurate. Especially, it was amazing too. Somebody who's not a pastor able to really get into the experience of a pastor and know what that's actually like
yeah,
especially the awkwardness that other people relate to pastors sometimes.
yeah.
um, yeah, especially like at a funeral, and various things that come out here,
Mm.
being so interesting. um, so guys, um, so one of the things that we're looking at in terms of just Christian culture, Christian art that we're studying is just evaluating it on two axes. One would be the the tension between light and darkness,
Oh yeah.
uh, and then the other one is the balance between, as the author we're looking at describes it, mumbling and shouting. So Christian art is going to, with that mumbling and shouting, it's not going to mumble the Christian message such that it really blurs the distinction. Like there's no gospel in it. On the other
Yeah.
hand, it's not going to shout it so loudly that the unbeliever will basically miss it because they'll be turned away. It's different than a sermon where we're actually trying to be hospitable by creating this space that allows the unbeliever to sort of enter into it, explore it, see what's up, and turn over the rocks, and then kind of absorb sort of a Christian worldview as they're doing it. And I just thought this was a excellent balance of that mumbling and shouting, as well as you know great with the tension between light and darkness, overall. Um,
Yeah, if I could jump in there,
yeah, yeah, please do.
uh, that's it is a great book in that it does balance all those things so well. I think one of the things I wrestle with, I've written about this, try to do it in my own writing, but it a lot of Christian writers today, I think in part to try to be accessible, they like to dwell so much in the darkness or in the doubt that um, it doesn't go anywhere. You know,
Yeah,
like we forget that the wilderness has a destination.
yeah,
Doubt has a direction.
yeah,
Um, so I a lot of frustration and a lot of problems I see in our communities trying to be almost too accessible. That comes at the expense of a message, not to be like not to say a message that's like shouted, like you're saying, like a message that raises interesting questions or um, that lays claim to something. And I think that's a little bit of like postmodernity coming in there, deconstructing um, deconstructing the world so much that like what are you left with? And I think a good Christian reader with something.
yeah,
And Robinson definitely does that. She leaves us with this beautiful story
yeah,
of doubt and suffering and suspicion. Um, so a love, of a father to his son and to his wife too.
yeah,
And anyway, yeah. So those are some quick thoughts I have on that.
yeah, yeah. The thing that struck me as I got partway through today, and you're right, it really is. It begs to be read slowly, not when you're trying to answer email and do a whole bunch of other things. And
Oh yeah,
so this was not the ideal way to read it. But the I don't know there's some way in which I kept thinking of the incarnation as I was working through this. Something of the incarnation and the presence of God in our lives,
mm,
in the sense that it talks about a lot of ordinary interactions. I mean, light coming into a church building, the child's face. I mean, it deals with weighty themes too, with racism and war and death, with major theme. But it also, in the midst of that, is just talking about these ordinary human experiences in such a way that it is showing those experiences to be beautiful.
oh yeah, yeah,
And then after reading it, I came home today and I noticed the beauty, I think, in my children and other things a little bit more so because I just was introduced to that. Um, and the way in which I read one thing that talks about how Christian art will be like creation, that will sort of gesture towards this transcendent reality. And it feels like there's that rumors of transcendence that sort of echo through here, which it's like it only makes sense. This beauty only makes sense from a decidedly Christian vantage point. Once you
Oh,
sort of
hold on, you
appreciate the beauty.
frozen. You froze there for a second.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, poor connection. Video resume. Automatically when the connection improves, it says. Can can you there at all? Oh, you're back.
Okay, sure. All right.
Um,
So
yeah,
saying
but
that it's the transcendent and
yeah, just does that? Do you see that in here?
oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what Marilyn Robinson does so well is kind of she's able to freeze these moments, these little scenes, little clips, and like invest it with um, you're totally right. Incarnational power with um, giving it beauty again. I love the moment, which I think is referred to several times, um, where the father, the pastor, gives communion to his son.
Yeah.
This beautiful intimacy, that's almost like this picture of divine love, that's so beautiful in there. And there's also there's a moment where he like praises the moon, and it's this beautiful. There's a moment where I'm trying to remember. There's like the burned church, and
Yeah.
then like rain, and there's the porch conversation when they talk about suffering. It's actually a scene told in three different books from three different perspectives. So it's also in Home, and it's also in Lila, I believe. Um, also a pivotal scene. But each of these are frozen moments, these tiny little moments of ordinary life. And I think Marilyn Robinson known it like, hey, like, the presence of God is in those moments. And it, um, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And then that, I guess you could say that those ordinary moments balance with the more extraordinary um, major theme of just death. Like how do you see that theme woven throughout here?
Oh, the theme of death.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And yet it's not. I mean, it's the whole thing's about death, right? He's preparing to die, but
Yeah.
it's not dark. I guess I
No,
would say.
no. I mean, in some ways, the whole book is like this necessary preparation. It's like this. Um, I don't want to say sanctifying because I know that's your thing, but
Well, that's okay. No, I think it's true. I
but
think it's true.
but it's like, yeah, it's like he has to go through these stories, these moments. He has to like slow down. He has to appreciate the beauty, to be ready for that good death, that we all want. And the book almost like eases away too. It's not like he put down his pen and died.
Yeah.
It's like these letters just kind of ease us into, and I think that's totally a right and true Christian understanding of death, that that it is this beautiful transformation that you know um, you close your eyes and you wake up, more alive than you ever were. I
Yeah.
was just the play Wit by Margaret Edson, which won the Pulitzer Prize, I think back in like '99 or something like that, and it's about a English professor who's missed out on life her whole life until she has terminal cancer, and it forces her
Mm,
come to terms with what it means to love and to be a
yeah.
good. And part of the paradox is that she spent her whole life researching 17th century poetry uh, that talks about God, like John Donne's poetry.
This okay?
And her big kind of one of her realizations is that
Close
through
your
John Donne's poetry, she learns that death is like this pause, uh,
eyes. Over here.
then a pause and a transition into kind of this beautifully um, that that's another good text I think to compare to Gilead. It's called Wit.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and the other thing I think it gets back to that kind of incarnational kind of aspect and the sense of like preparation and working out our faith, that I think Gilead explores so well. I've just been thinking. I have some notes that I've typed up from Marilyn Robinson. She has an essay called "Imagination and Community,"
Oh.
which is a really great essay. It's online, and you can also find it in her collection. Now with I read books, and she says, "I think fiction, whatever else, an exercise in the capacity for imaginative love, or sympathy, or identification." So I think you really see that, like that. Basically, writing is this exercise of love.
Yeah. Yeah.
She even talks about like loving your characters,
Yeah.
which is something that I'm not sure a lot of writers think about actively or actively practice.
Hmm.
I was just at a reading on Monday night of a Christian writer, Leif Enger, who wrote Peace Like a River. It's kind of his most famous novel. But he talked about how he loves his characters, and often the characters he loves the most are the villains or the bad guys or the antagonists. because there's something I don't know, almost like, or just to love, to realize that your characters, to practice this kind of like image of God kind of thing, and to love your neighbor even when your neighbor is your antagonist, and as
Yeah,
a writer,
yeah,
you you're God, and that you're able to breathe life into these characters, but to love them and to see, and almost to, as a writer, to like release that control, let you know let those characters kind of become their own.
yeah.
And I think Marilyn Robinson is great about that. Um, I've got a couple of other quotes too.
Oh, can I just follow up with
Yeah,
something
yeah.
there? Um, Curious your thoughts as a writer. Uh, so I've heard it said that it's hard to. I think David Pallison said this. As you know, he's a counselor, astute observer of human nature. He said that authors find it very, very difficult to write a character that is truly good without that character being flat.
Oh yeah.
And it just occurs to me as you're talking that that seems to be what he, what she's done here. Though we have a character that really does is not without faults. I mean, at the beginning he says that he gets angry very easily. So much wisdom just like pieced in there in that very beginning part.
Mm.
But yet the goodness and the love comes through so clearly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think Marilyn Robinson has done, as best I can tell. She's written a character who's very virtuous and great, wise
Yeah,
and
well,
wonderful, and everything, and yeah, um, I don't know. Um, I think you know it's the opposite. I think for the problem Christian writing is, you see. Um, I can think of like Graham Greene's Power and the Glory, which is like another famous Christian-ish novel. But the problem with that, with the main character there, who's a priest, he's called a whiskey priest. He's this drunk priest who kind of dwells in doubt and everything, and he's supposed to be viewed as this like great protagonist. I love the book, but I struggle with it. Same thing with Silence. The Shaku Endo's Japanese uh, of a novel about missionaries to Japan.
yeah, yeah,
You've read that? That was a big one a couple years ago when the movie came out. But same thing, where you've got these characters who are so wrestled up with their own doubt and failings, that it kind of becomes hard. You wish that they had more to them, that there was more good in them.
mm-hmm.
And in some sense, I feel like it's easier to write that character. It's easier to write the character that has his or her faults, and those are on the forefront. But I think what you're totally right about Gilead is that the beauty of it is that he's a good guy, but it takes an extremely skilled writer to pull that off, as you said, without it being flat. Because we know the bad stories of just flat good characters and nothing happens.
Yeah,
It's funny. I think in part it's a kind of a sad and dangerous thing that as humans we gravitate. We want to see good people fail, and a lot of our movies and stories are about that, which I think is kind of sad and chilling. Um, a famous one is Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's novel, where about a guy who is driven to the brink, and who murders ultimately. But even Dostoevsky says that at the end of the novel, he's like, okay, well, I've written a novel about a guy who has been brought low, and now he's going to be transformed. Now he believes, like, the stories that he is transformed and believes. But that's kind of the story. The story ends with Raskolnikov, the main character, just starting to get a glimmer of transformation, starting to pursue the good. Um, but but Dostoevsky himself says a better something like I'm not that good of a writer. to write the next story, which is the story of Raskolnikov being transformed into a good person. So it's even when the greatest novelist ever says, "Hey, this is too hard a story to tell skillfully," I think that's something that I'm just fascinated with it. I don't know why we can't write good characters, why we get bored by goodness.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so
yeah. That doesn't say good things about our human nature. That it's yeah.
absolutely.
I um yeah. That's interesting. The I can't keep the students all day with this thing. There's so much we could talk about here. Uh, the writing style. I mean, I think I was sucked in with the very first paragraph. It says, "I told you last night that I might be gone sometime," and you said, "Where?" And I said, "To be with the good Lord." And you said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I'm old." And you said, "I don't think you're old." And you put your hand in my hand and you said, "You aren't very old," as if that settled it.
Hmm.
And I was just drawing in from that moment where the lightness of the words in the midst of something so weighty. I guess that contrast just gripped me.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, she is she's so good at just kind of dancing, as you say, kind of with these kind of simple words, and yet investing in them with such richness. And the other thing too is that it's not like, while it is kind of a chronological novel, it's not like a typical novel with like a plot, beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah, yeah. There's no chapters.
Yeah, yeah. It's just these paragraph breaks,
Hmm.
and if you get what he's feeling in the moment. Yeah, and the plot doesn't really enter until Jack shows up. The guy he's suspicious of, and kind of considers a rival in some capacity. Um, but yeah, so yeah, it's just, I don't know what you can say about the style besides it's great. It's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. That's good. So if you, what my students have to do for this class, I'm teaching Christ and Culture, where they have two assignments. One they've already done. The first is to pick a cultural work that is done from um, a non-Christian perspective. So any movie or book or whatever that's not trying to replicate the Christian worldview. Of course, there's Christian worldview elements in it just because of common grace, but that's not the intention, at least.
Yeah.
And then to evaluate it, there were criteria that we read in a book, and we use that. The second assignment they have, which is due at the end, is to pick a work that is from a explicitly Christian perspective, that's trying to say something about the Christian worldview and the gospel, and then to evaluate it and to just ask how good of a job does it do. We're using this as an example that we're going to talk about in class more of one that I think does an excellent job. Um,
Mm,
and then we'll talk through it with that. And then their assignment is to pick a work, or to actually, because I have some artists and writers in my class, to actually do a work on their own and then explain how that work on their own fits with the Christian perspective. So with a view towards that assignment, what would you say? Maybe there's so much nuance in here about how to do that really, really well, and it obviously takes a lifetime to reflect on and work on. But what are maybe some of the low hanging fruit, easy things to say that, yeah, she definitely does this, that would be an example to either reproduce in
mhm,
their own work, or to look for in others?
mhm. Yeah, I mean, um, what comes to mind again is that concept of loving characters. I think that's a big tool, I think, for the Christian writer. I think also to point towards positivity, but not like a trite kind of like dressing up the world, but to say it's possible to write a story about a good marriage, for example.
Hmm. Hmm.
Possible to write a story about a great relationship between a father and a son. We
Hmm.
don't. it's so much of the stories out there are the opposite,
Hmm.
stories of marriages falling apart, stories of, and there's a lot of that pain and suffering. Uh, but I think being able to point to something, being able to champion something and celebrate something, um, uh, in particular, the mark or can be the mark of a Christian writer. At the same time, I think you don't. I think our task also as writers, as Christian writers too, is also to just be transparent and not to be honest. And what that means is don't tidy up the world, don't purify the world. The world, has sin at its
Hmm.
root.
Hmm.
The world is suffering, and a lot of these,
And for all the goodness of the father son relationship we hear, there are so many broken relationships.
yeah, and those should totally be written about as well.
Yeah.
And I think solidarity is a great opportunity, is a great thing to keep in mind as a writer, to be able to speak on the behalf of those who um, or to speak with them rather, those who are marginalized. I think there's a really particular Christian opportunity there. Um, and so much of the writing that I love is just about speaking truth to suffering, or speaking love to suffering, um, to just to say, like, I hear you, like, you're in this moment, you're in this place.
Hmm.
Here's a story that speaks to you, that it's okay where you are. Um,
That's being hospitable too, because it's inviting the non-Christian into that world,
yeah,
and they can get help for, I mean, their suffering as well.
yeah, and it's not a story that is going to solve it. It's not a
Hmm.
story that is necessarily going to give an answer for it, because we wrestle with those questions of suffering and the goodness of God and all that kind of stuff. Um, but I think there's something particularly Christian in it. If so much of Christ, of our understanding of Christ, is of suffering,
Hmm.
the cross.
Hmm.
And so, not that we should dwell, in the pain and the suffering, but that I think is essential to the gospel message. Is you know that suffering in some shape or form, um, is redemptive, and there's something to that.
Yeah.
And I think that's great for writers to explore that. And I think the world responds well to that. We all have our stories, our sufferings, and when you can demonstrate as a writer that I love these characters, I'm loving these people in this you know maybe dark place. Um, I think that can speak a whole lot.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. There were a few parts here that I really liked, underlined them, where it occurred to me of what I heard in Tim Keller's book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, about that same theme. Obviously, a nonfiction work there, but that God doesn't waste our suffering. And he talked about how he remembers pain and he remembers loneliness. But what he remembers about that is the comfort. So, a lot of his life was pain because through most of his life, he was alone, had his wife and child die when he was young, and then spent most of his life without, before he married his new wife. And when he talked about looking back on that time, it was loneliness, but what he remembers was the comfort in that loneliness. So I just thought that was such a beautiful reality there too, that looking back on our pain, we can look back with the confidence that what we remember is not the pain. We remember the comfort from God in the midst of that pain.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so
no,
anyway, yeah, that just came to my mind and what you were saying there.
love that.
So cool. Well, what are just to sort of end us all? I have a sleeping baby in my arms now. We'll talk about the ordinary life though. Just woke up here. Well, no, not that much of a baby. She just turned 3.
Mm.
Uh, and she'll be on forever remembered now for falling asleep in the midst of your lecture. And hopefully, your students in school don't do this, right?
Oh no, well, yeah, they do. No,
They don't nod off. Um, So what are you working on in terms of you're a writer, and so you do poetry, and are you working on any other novels, or what's your
Yeah, I've got my problem is I start too many projects and don't finish them. So I'm primarily a poet. A lot of what I'm trying to work on now is I don't know. To a lot of my writing has been about growing up overseas, son of missionaries in Chad, and kind of dealing with like physical dislocation. And one of the ways I'm trying to challenge myself now is to connect that with the spiritual. So my personal identity, I feel disconnected.
so you're like what we would call a third culture kid in that?
The whole third culture concept.
Yeah,
Uh, but one thing I'm trying to write poems more and more about is how how closely that mirrors spiritual, and that the just a reminder that you know this world is not our own. The kingdom is now and yet and not yet.
yeah,
And how in some ways we are aliens or strangers, and yet we're called. I do think we're called definitely to love and um, you know be as best we can. Christ to the people around us. So I'm trying to, yeah, with my poetry, I'm trying to kind of invest some spiritual stuff into that.
hmm
Um, I'm also working on a bit of like a memoir, talking about growing up as well. So trying to see a lot of the things I've written poems about through prose, through nonfiction. Um, oh, and then I've got a novel project that I'm also working on um, as well. That's set in Chad. So yeah, I'm a lot related to you know growing up in Chad and kind of being from many places at once.
yeah,
But I've writing a lot of essays and stuff as well on belief and doubt and
yeah,
suffering for things I published online and stuff. So I'm trying to kind of dabble and
yeah,
as best I can, and trying to point people towards things, and um, hopefully do a little bit of practice a little bit of what I preach, so to speak.
yeah.
So
Great. I think that's an interesting dynamic. I hadn't thought of it before, but how third, like so growing up, you're not really from America, nor are you really from Chad,
yeah,
and that's a great um, analogy or parallel or metaphor. I don't know exactly what category that would fit in for the way in which we are. Uh, this world is not our home. We're in Christ and in America at the same time, and we don't quite. It's not that we don't fit in Christ, but we're not. What we are in Christ is not fully revealed. So we know, but by faith, but not by sight. And yet, this world is not our home, but this is the world in which we're physically located right now. So, yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful thing there. That's interesting.
so we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, yes, it's good. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I will sign us out with the students.